People with disabilities lived in the shadows of society. They were allowed to live, but their talents were not of national concern. Their living conditions were not particularly the focus. They were more or less just tolerated as long as they stayed off on the side in the shadows. People with disabilities themselves got organized and started to advocate and raise community awareness within the various towns and villages and cities across this country.
As discriminatory barriers are eliminated, citizens with disabilities in America and in all nations will become producers.
On July 26, 1990, after centuries of excluding people with disabilities, followed by years of protest and ongoing diplomatic negotiations, President George H.W. Bush signed the Americans with Disabilities Act into law. Initially, ADA sparked ongoing debate and resistance from the business community due to costs associated with the law's architectural modification requirements and failed to immediately change overall attitudes concerning people with disabilities. However, ADA was enormously successful in transforming the lives of people with disabilities through improved access and opportunity that took them out of the shadows of society and into the mainstream. Long before the ADA's passage, people with disabilities weren't seen as equal humans, but as an irrelevant population. They were often hidden and experienced harsh, discriminatory treatment that left them segregated from mainstream society. In fact, during the 1700s, people with disabilities were chained to walls, and in the 1800s and 1900s, because families lacked support and resources, they were sent to poor farms, prisons, asylums, and institutions, which were underfunded, overcrowded, and provided inadequate care. Additionally, in the early 20th century, eugenics became increasingly popular in the medical community. Based on the theory of social Darwinism, eugenics aimed to improve the human race through controlling hereditary characteristics. However, in practice, eugenics led to the passage of draconian laws that mandated forcible sterilization of undesirable, defectives, and mentally retarded individuals, as disabled individuals were known at the time, which made them unable to reproduce. Thus, for centuries, people with disabilities were hidden in the shadows of society by harsh policies and practices that excluded them from participation. Before the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed in 1990, government actions were few and far between. For instance, the Smith-Sears Veterans Rehabilitation Act of 1918 provided disabled World War I veterans with insurance money and rehabilitation. In the 1930s, the Social Security program, which was introduced as a part of the New Deal, provided financial assistance to families caring for a disabled family member. Additionally, the Fair Housing Act of 1968 put forth that new multifamily dwellings had to be accessible for people with disabilities. However, while these actions produced small gains, they fell frustratingly short of removing employment and living barriers for people with physical and mental disabilities. Real change for people with disabilities came not through the efforts of any single person, but rather through the actions of many different people who made up the disability rights movement that eventually secured the passage of ADA. In 1973, Section 504 was added to the Rehabilitation Act, which marked the first time any law made it illegal to discriminate against disabled people. Lawsuits were filed, diplomacy in the form of negotiations took place, testimonies were given, and many other methods were leveraged to bring urgency back concerning enforcement of Section 504 regulations. However, after President Ronald Reagan took office, he established the Task Force on Regulatory Relief, which sought to deregulate Section 504 because it was burdensome on businesses. The first version of the ADA was introduced by Senator Lowell Weicker and Representative Tony Coelho in 1988.
This is a correct language, an historic occasion. The time has come to end all discrimination in whatever form.
And so it is time that our government recognize our abilities and give us the dignity to do what we can do.
A key aspect of which required both public and private businesses and organizations to break down architectural barriers such as stairs, curbs, and narrow doorways, or they had to provide an alternative for people with disabilities, like ramps. This sparked heated debate over the bill's effectiveness and boundaries, as well as many meetings to discuss such problems. By 1989, Senators Kennedy and Harkin, who had disabled family members, and Senator Coelho, who himself was disabled, extended their own diplomatic influence toward passage of the ADA by personally addressing Congress and coalescing their efforts to pass this important legislation.
Republicans and Democrats worked together. We did things together. We had a president of the United States who was a Republican that was a big supporter of it. We had liberals and conservatives that understood this was a very important thing to do in furtherance of civil rights in America.
Additionally, Justin Dart, chair of the Congressional Task Force on the Rights and Empowerment of People with Disabilities, held public hearings that were attended by thousands of people with disabilities, their friends, and family members, citing the injustice of discrimination in the lives of people with disabilities. However, the business community inserted substantial doubt into the debate surrounding ADA through letters and their own testimony concerning the extreme costs of architecturally modifying businesses to make them accessible. Diplomatic negotiations in Congress successfully alleviated some of the business community's concern.
You negotiate because you find out what their concerns are and you see what you can do to address them. You can make loans available for restroom remodeling. You can give subsidies to the cities for curb cuts. So you can ease the impact of the legislations on their particular situation. Talking to various people in various constituencies across the country to convince them to accept this legislation.
However, despite progress in negotiations, after 2 years, the bill remained stalled in Congress. On March 12, 1990, the disabilities community rallied at the Capitol, a pivotal moment in the path to access, in which they leveraged the power of the media to show Congress and the world the barriers they faced. Out of their chairs and up the stairs, hundreds of people with disabilities crawled up the Capitol steps as the unseasonably hot afternoon sun beat down on them.
I'll take all night. I have to.
We'll be here all night. We're going to be here, don't worry. We'll be here as long as it takes. As long as it takes.
Their tactic was both shocking and successful in changing public sentiment and pushing the bill to final passage. July 26, 1990, marked a triumphant moment for people with disabilities as the ADA was signed by President George H.W. Bush on the White House lawn.
This historic act is the world's first comprehensive declaration of equality for people with disabilities. The first.
This transformative law included many specific requirements that promoted improved access and accessibility for people with disabilities.
As soon as it was signed into law, it then means that the federal government has a responsibility to enforce the law. Immediately, not only did it impact those of us with disabilities, but it also became an accommodation for the general public.
The law's physical accommodation requirements, which were crucial for access to facilities, stood at the center of public debate because it meant that schools and workplaces were required to have ramps, elevators, designated parking spots, and curb cuts, and to provide accommodations for people with a range of disabilities, including those who are blind or deaf. As a result, a full decade after ADA became law, there remained significant progress to be made. Attitudes were slow to change, and compliance with the law's requirements often didn't happen until complaints were filed against the business owner. Despite its imperfect implementation, in the 3 decades since its passage, the Americans with Disabilities Act has made enormous strides towards fulfilling the vision set forth by our founding fathers to create a more perfect union by removing societal barriers for people with disabilities. Today, people with disabilities are contributing to society and living full lives through holding jobs, supporting their families, and finally stepping out of the shadows.
You don't have to be a space physicist with a disability to be recognized. You can be the person down the street who's making a living because you can get a job and taking care of your family. What changed is that the pool of talent and the ability of people to live happily in their own lives, in their own manner, has just exploded.